For the last part of this lesson, you're going to learn about one final piece of the puzzle, adding data binding with lifecycle library support. This will clean up boilerplate code and let us use data binding to its full potential. Let's review where you've seen data binding before. Thus far, you've used data binding as a type-safe way to get views. By inflating our layout and using data binding, I now have this binding object, which contains just references to the views defined in this layout. But the real power of data binding is what the name suggests, taking data and binding it to a view object. Right now we have our XML layout, which defines views, and we have data for those views in the view model. In between sits the UI controller, which is really just acting as a relay between the two. For example, when data in the view model changes, an observer in the fragment will update the views. Or when you're in the layout defining views, you might define some buttons that need to be hooked up to methods in the view model with onClick listeners. It would be simpler if the data and the views could just communicate directly without relying on the UI controller so much as an intermediary. You might have seen examples where you can pass an object into data binding, such as this myName object, which contains a nickname and a name. Once you pass this object into data binding will update the appropriate views. Well, it turns out that your view model holds a lot of your UI data, so it's actually a really great object to pass into the data binding. Once you've done this, you can automate some of the communication between the view model and the views so that you don't need to even involve the UI controller. Let's start by passing the game view model into the game_fragment XML and passing the score view model into the score_fragment.xml. I'm going to start here in game_fragment.xml. I'm going to scroll down below the layout tag, and I'm going to create a data variable. And that variable is going to be for game view model. Keep in mind that after you make this variable, you might need to rebuild the app. Next, I want to go over here to my project and open up my game fragment. I have my binding and I have my view model, so right here, I'm going to take my binding and I'm going to pass in my view model. Now, just by letting my binding know about my view model, I can get rid of some of the code in the game fragment. The first example I'll show is replacing the onClick listeners. Let's go back to the game fragment. I'm going to scroll down to the skip button. And here I'm going to add a onClick attribute. And I'm going to add some code that's going to directly call the viewModel's onSkip method. And I'm going to copy this code, and I'm going to do the same thing for the onCorrect button. But instead of calling onSkip, I'll call onCorrect. Anytime that you have this @ symbol followed by the curly braces within your XML, it's an example of a data binding expression. Inside of a data binding expression, meaning between the two curly braces, you could do simple things like display a value. But you could also use these expressions to call a method, or to handle onClick. For onClick, what this code does is it sets up the onClick listener, and it registers this lambda as the listener. Now, because I've done this for my correct button and for my skip button, I could go back to the game fragment, and I scroll down, and I no longer need to set up these two onClick listeners because I've already set them up in the XML. So I could go ahead and remove them. In this way, I'm removing the fragment as an intermediary that used to set up the onClick listeners. And instead, I'm having the views here communicate directly with the view model. Alright, let's go ahead and make sure that that worked. Okay, and my buttons still work. I'll show you more about data binding in the next video, but for now, I want you to finish up this exercise by passing the view model into the binding for game_fragment, like I just showed you, and for score_fragment. For all of these buttons, make onClick listener attributes in the buttons that call the view model methods directly. And once you're done with that, remove the now unnecessary click listener code from the Kotlin fragments.